Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. We apologize for the delay, but we promise that this is going to be a wonderful day for the first day of our webinar series. This is going to be an exciting day due to, well, the topics are very, very interesting to say the least. Okay, just a few reminders before we officially start this webinar. Just kindly mute your microphones and switch off your video upon logging in. And for the duration of the conference, use your registered name as your Zoom display name, and also be patient because sometimes there are instances that the connection is low and the reception might not be good. Okay, so for those watching up north, naimbag abigat, in the Visayas, maayong buntag, maayong aga, and in Mindanao, there are a lot also watching there. So Mapia Alao, Marayaw Maynaat, Ahap Subu, Hugh Halafus sa ating lahat. Okay. So, mabuhay. Welcome to the 31st the first day of the 31st National Conference on National and Local History of the Philippine National Historical Society. I am E.A. Sembrano, your moderator for today's session. Coincidentally, PNHS was established in 1941, and today is, or this year is the 41st, no? Anyway, hindi naman taon-taon merong konferensya. This is the 41st staging of the webinar series. This first online conference is organized again by the Philippine National Historical Society in partnership with the National Commission for Culture and the Arts and the Philippine Social Science Council. We would like to acknowledge the NCCA headed by Chairman Arsenio Lizazo, Executive Director Alrayan Alejandre, PNHS members as well, and board of the PNHS and the Manila Studies Association, participants via Zoom, and participants via Facebook Live. No, we are live on Facebook on the PNHS Facebook page. We would also like to remind everyone that the proceedings of this webinar are recorded for purposes of documentation. Okay, to start today's session, we will have our national anthem, followed by a prayer by Father Michael Layugan and Dr. Calvi Asain for the Islamic prayer.
mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas. Kayang magiliw, kaya sa silanganan, alam ng puso, sa litig mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, tuyag ka ng magiting, sa mandulupin, di ka pasisigil, sa nagatang tunog sa simoy at sa nalit ko pagaw, ay nilatang tulang awin sa pagkayang minamahal. Ang isang ang matawad, ngunit ang buhay na nagtinig, pangituwin at araw niya kailan pa may matitigil. Lumang ang araw ng walhagin pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Aming bigaya ng pagkay ng amin, at mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Okay, let's now have Father Michael Layugan for the prayer, followed by the Islamic prayer by Dr. Calvi Asain.
Good morning po sa inyong lahat. Let us now pause for a few moments and, put ourselves in the presence of God. Most loving and merciful God, we come together in this PNHS conference as seekers of the truth and collaborators in the pursuit of the good of society. We approach you today to beseech you to grant us a listening ear, to be more receptive of the things we hear, an alert mind to understand what we hear, and a will to have the courage to plunge into whatever new insights this conference brings. Fill our conversations with your wisdom and truth, and may your presence sustain us throughout this event. We are gathered this morning to begin a conference on the stories that are all around us, stories that build our histories, and stories that make us human. Allow your Spirit to fill our very being, most gracious and loving God, as we now pause to remember those beautiful stories needing to be told and shared. Widen our vision so that the narratives that are shared during this conference may come to be known also as our history. For in our stories, we are most human when we see the humanity in the others through their stories. As the COVID-19 pandemic continued to weaken our spirits, show us how to give ourselves to those who are without hope. to those who are suffering, and we pray that we may overcome this great trial. In your love, we find our healing and joy. In your mercy, we find our peace. In your wisdom, we find our guidance. Bless this conference so that we may engage in a meaningful exchange of new findings, new perspectives, and new discoveries about who we are as a people, so that through them we may gain insight as a guiding light for a new direction towards becoming a better people and towards building and sustaining a brighter future. And continue to remind us that all that we do here today, all that we accomplish, is for the pursuit of truth, for the praise and glory of your name, and for the service of your people. We ask a special blessing for the organizers of this conference, for the speakers, and all the participants, and all those who are involved in this event. All this we ask in the name of the God of history, the God who is ever present in the stories that make us the people we are today. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Good morning po sa inyo.
Thank you, Father Layugan. Now for the Islamic prayer, Dr. Calvi Asay.
Let us pray to the Almighty God, the benevolent, the merciful, and the all-knowing, to help us and guide us to the right path of historical knowledge. We pray further that through history we can foster or bring about national unity, understanding, and solidarity. And furthermore, we pray that our webinar will be successful, fruitful, and memorable. May God bless us all.
Okay, thank you. Now for the opening remarks, let's welcome the President of the Cultural Center of the Philippines and Chairman of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, Honorable Arsenio Nick Lizaso.
Isang magandang araw sa ating lahat. In times of uncertainty, we look back at history to guide us how to proceed and to tell us how it might all end up. Ang hindi lumingon sa nakaraan ay mahihirapang makarating sa paroroonan. This particular coronavirus may be new, but history tells us that we have seen it all before. And when we don't learn the lessons of history, as someone warned us, we are condemned to repeat it. This is precisely why historians and historical researchers are valuable to humankind. They document the rich details of what is happening in our times. Right now, they are taking note of the stories taking shape around COVID-19, with an abiding interest in how we as Filipinos respond and cope with this contagious disease. For beyond the minutiae of what's happening, there is something about the epidemics that future generations would want to know. The universal lessons that we need to heed. We therefore need you to go back to work. You need to write the first drafts of our nation's history during this pandemic year and hereafter. The pandemic might have separated us physically, but we all must continue with our work and duty. Today's 41st Conference on Local and National History is an essential platform to fulfill that duty. As the oldest organization of experts in the country's history, the Philippine National Historical Society Incorporated is at the forefront of advancing issues related to the local history and integrating them into the development of the Filipino, anchoring several historic events such as the quincentennial commemorations, the commemoration of the end of World War II, and other topics relevant to the current climate. The conference is expected to provide multifaceted research and discussions for our participants, necessary for the education of the next generation of Filipinos. At this point, we would like to pay tribute to our fervent partners, the National Museum of the Philippines, which is the main custodian of the country's heritage, and the Philippine Social Science Council, Incorporated, an association of institutions and experts in the social sciences, partners who have given their full support to the aspirations of the NCCA and PNHS. We also want to recognize Dr. Bernardita Churchill, the PNHS, and the historians who tirelessly continue our aspiration for history. Now more than ever, our understanding and look at the history of our country is being tested. The role of historians today depends on our sworn duty to share knowledge and to speak for the history, heritage, and culture of our country. Together, let us deepen our knowledge and appreciation of our history, then as well as now as it is being made. Muli, maraming salamat po at mabuhay tayong lahat sa pagpapalaganap ng kamalayan at kahalagahan ng kultura at kasaysayan ng ating bansa.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lizaso, for that inspiring message and your continued support to the Philippine National Historical Society. Now let us welcome the PSSC Executive Director, Lourdes M. Portus, for her message. Just please bear with us. We will have Dr. Portus's message in a moment.
Chairperson Arsenio Lizaso of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, the Dr. Bernardita Churchill, President of the Philippine National Historical Society Incorporated and convener of the 41st National Conference on Local and National History, Dr. Maria Nela Florendo, co-convener of this prestigious conference, representatives from the National Historical Commission of the Philippines Local Historical Committees Network and NCCA Committee on Historical Research, distinguished guests, presenters, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I wish to congratulate PNHS for organizing this national conference amid the pandemic. We thought COVID-19 would freeze our normal lives and activities and limit the things we could do as scholars, researchers, teachers, and learners. However, despite the quarantine, lockdown, other restrictions, and narrowed down choices, the spirit of the committed scholar and historian refuses to die down. We must respond and adapt to the circumstances. We have to switch from offline to online mode and embrace technology and the virtual world. Thus, it is amazing that notwithstanding the fact that Dr. Churchill is in America, and most of you are in the other parts of the Philippines and the world perhaps, and myself currently holding another meeting on this very day and time, we can still be together electronically. As I browse through the studies that will be presented during this conference, it is amazing that we will get a glimpse of events from prehistoric, pre-colonial Philippines to 15th century events to World War II and the current pandemic episodes. That long span indeed. How quick our historians are in already scrutinizing the way we do innovative research in the time of lockdown, such as archaeologists working in the laboratory for collected artifacts and conducting archival and library research. How definitely interesting it is to hear where the Philippines is vis-a-vis the global pandemic history and how COVID-19 gripped the contemporary world in an unexpected pandemic in the 21st century. And of course, how thought-provoking it is when we come to know the methods and strategies in teaching Philippine history in a virtual classroom. This gives us the proper motivation to get excited and attend this national conference. The Philippine Social Science Council recognizes the value of history in our lives and would like to contribute in appreciating history and join you in elevating the historical discourses to a higher degree. For this reason, PSSC will devote its annual publication of PSSC's newsletter, the Social Science Information or SSI, to history with no less than Dr. BERNARDITA Churchill as its featured social scientist. In particular, the issue will delve into the phenomenon of historical revisionism, a misinterpretation or alteration of history by those with political ambitions. Historians and other social scientists are playing a large part in resisting the distortion of historical events to miseducate the Filipino people. Our SSI desires to lay bare the efforts of social scientists, especially historians, in combating historical revisionism and to feature expert opinions or on research on Philippine political memory and historical truths in the country, and also to promote history as an important social science discipline. One interesting presentation in this conference, and one which I really would like to listen to, and perhaps be cited in our SSI issue on historical revisionism, and because this gives a new tweak and dimension of the word historical revisionism, is that of Dr. Churchill's vision of Philippine history and how the Philippines has been referred to as a many-layered place and an archipelago of exchange. In her study, she noted that we must, quote, revision history in its natural setting in Southeast Asia and consequently to really know the Philippines' history, culture, heritage, unquote. She also said, and I again quote, much of the history that we have learned and continue to teach our students miss or gloss over our pre-colonial history, culture, and heritage, thus obscuring the various racial, cultural traditions that underpin Filipino identity, unquote. Just recently, the University of the Philippines celebrated a day of remembrance to highlight the need for truth-seeking and retribution following the dictatorship. It also stresses having the proper educational mechanism on the part of historians to instill a collective memory on the evils of martial law. We need to ferret out the truth on what happened in one of the darkest histories of our country. We need to keep on working and studying our national life and why till this day we remain to be regarded as a third world country. Why poverty, corruption, and various social ills are still upon us. We need to look into the lives of our ancestors and remember the lessons they imparted as our duty and service to the country. We need to write history from the lenses and the prism of the historians. I laud PNHS and all other social science organization members of PSSC in never-ending quest for truth and knowledge, in their incessant struggle to keep their disciplines alive by mounting conferences, conducting research, and publishing worthwhile studies. I look forward to PNHS publication of the studies in this conference, which to me characterizes the commitment to keep history as a discipline thriving amidst the many problems in our society, this pandemic included. So mabuhay ang mga historiador ng bayan, mabuhay ang PNHS, mabuhay ang PSSC. Good day and thank you everyone.
Maraming salamat po, Ma'am Portus, for your message. And also, we would like to acknowledge her, Dr. Portus, who is here with us today. And we would also like to acknowledge the more than 200 viewers and counting on Facebook. Again, good morning from the Philippines to the world, because we have participants from other parts of the world also. Okay, for the webinar orientation, here is Professor Marianela Florendo, the co-convener of this momentous event.
Thank you, Father Mike Layugan and Dr. Calvi Asain for the prayers. Chairman Lizazo and Dr. Pertus, we're grateful for your very inspiring messages. We look forward to PNHS continuing partnership with the National Commission for Culture and the Arts and the Philippine Social Science Council. At this point, I also wish to acknowledge the presence of the PNHS board and participants from the NCCA. I acknowledge all of you who are attending this webinar, whether on Zoom, Facebook, or other digital platforms. Based on the registration data, we have more than 1,600 registered participants representing geographic areas as far as Northern Luzon and down south in Holos, Sulu. We also welcome our participants from across the seas. Former participants of PNHS conferences must be feeling a sense of nostalgia. The annual conferences for us have been a venue for updates on historical researches, as well as the forging of linkages and friendships. Most of us would arrive the day before the conference, hold the conference in 2 days, interspersed with cultural shows, then travel together for our Lakbay Aral on the 3rd day. We should be in Silliman University for this conference, but the pandemic has required us to shift to a virtual platform, thus these webinars. Our webinar series starts today, October 24, and will continue on a 2-week interval. Webinar 2 is on November 14. The last webinar is on November 28. We close the webinar series with the launch of the Journal of History, a harvest of peer-reviewed papers from the 2019 conference, and the historic 59-page 2019 PNHS newsletter. To conclude, we shall also hear announcements from our 2021 conference host. We keep our fingers crossed that conditions will be better next year for us to hold a face-to-face conference. Sustaining the tradition of the Philippine National Historical Society, the papers for this conference allow us to revisit historical events that are being commemorated, as well as address relevant issues like the health crisis that needs a historical context. 2021 marks the quincentennial of three events. The first, circumnavigation of the world, the introduction of Christianity, and the victory of the Battle of Mactan. Dr. Churchill's paper sets the context for revisiting 1521, while Dr. Rolando Borinaga provides us a legacy of Christianity. Dr. Earl Cleopes and Dr. Marcelino Macapinlac's papers on the Japanese occupation are in consonance with the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. The current pandemic gives us an occasion to examine the past and how Filipinos handled and perceived similar crises. Papers on pandemics will be delivered by Dr. Planta and Dr. George Borinaga. Research and instruction during pandemics and crises are tackled in the papers of Drs. Bolunia, Florendo, and Cleope. Let us not forget that in celebration of Women's Month, Professors Regalado Trota Jose and Edgar Allan Sembrano will highlight women's inheritance rights during the early Spanish colonial period. Through the years, PNHS has strived to be inclusive in consideration of our diversity by virtue of gender, ethnicity, religious affiliation, and other forms of social differentiation. This year, though, we regret that we do not have papers on Muslim history and Mindanao history. We hope all these papers in our webinar series will keep us intellectually engaged and inspire us to contribute in our modest ways to historical scholarship, to relevant and dynamic history and social studies curriculum development, towards good citizenship. Now we have reminders for participants. For those who would like to receive an e-certificate for attending the 41st National Conference on Local and National History, please make sure that one, you are two, you attend at least 2 of the 3 webinars, but we would appreciate if you attend all the webinars. 3, you should fill out the evaluation of each webinar that you attend, which means you should at least submit 2 evaluations. We request that you visit the NHS website to accomplish the online evaluation after each webinar. Your e-certificate will be emailed after November 28, the last webinar. Just please be patient because the Secretariat will have to process the requirements for the release of the e-certificate. Now, on membership to PNHS, we enjoin all PNHS members to renew their membership, the link of which is available in the circular that you received or may be downloaded from the PNHS website. Your annual fees are waived for this year. We invite participants to file their membership with PNHS. And per instruction from Dr. Churchill, new membership applications filed in 2020 are also free. Your membership will be duly acknowledged. In case you filed your new membership and paid your fee, well, thank you. And the good news is your payment shall be carried as your fee for 2021. Please visit the website for new membership applications. Now, I cannot let this pass. We thank our technical team with Professor Manuel Zamora at the helm and with the assistance of E.A. Sembrano, Kina Kwan, Noy Makapinlak, and Ronald Escanlar. They are in charge of the technical aspect of the webinars. So, from Northern Luzon to the tip of Mindanao, our dear participants, let us all sit back and listen to our paper presenters today. Salamat po. Everyone keep safe, and we'll see you in the next webinars.
Maraming salamat po, Professor Florendo, mula sa City of Pines, no? Kung matatawag pa natin City of Pines yun, no? Anyway, for the speakers, or for our participants today, before I introduce to you the first speaker, I would just like to remind everyone to write down your comments or questions in the chat box for the speakers to answer at the end of the session. Please indicate your name and your institutional affiliation. Again, this conference is organized by the Philippine National Historical Society in partnership with the National Commission for Culture and the Arts and the Philippine Social Science Center. Thank you again to our participants who registered for this event. We hope that we will be able to we will be able to learn more about our rich history and heritage from this morning's session. Okay, our first speaker is from the Philippine National Historical Society and also from the University of the Philippines. Okay, so I will read first the abstract of her paper before I introduce her and present her paper entitled Revisioning Philippine History, Knowing the Philippines. The abstract: the Philippines has been described variously as a singular and a plural place, noting an island archipelagic appearance of over 7,000 islands and a nation of over 109 million people. A unified country with a single people calling themselves Filipinos, and a highly fragmented and plural society of Christians, Muslims, and indigenous peoples, mainly Austronesians, all forming a beautiful and colorful mosaic. The Philippines is also described as a many-layered place, looking at the cultural and historical complexities that have created it, starting with the migrations of peoples and ideas from prehistoric days and moving through the consequent layering of peoples and cultures that have melted to be distinctly Filipino. Latterly, it has also been referred to as an archipelago of exchange, referring to the rich traditions of pre-colonial culture as seen in art, sculptures, pottery, textile, and personal ornaments, attesting to Austronesian roots and a rich maritime history prior to the arrival of the Spaniards. Having spent almost a lifetime studying and teaching Philippine history, I maintain that much of the history that we have learned and continue to teach our students miss or gloss over our pre-colonial history, culture, and heritage, thus obscuring the various racial and cultural traditions that underpin Filipino identity. It is this long prehistory or proto-history before Western contact and the impact of early Spanish colonization that is the focus of this presentation. To revisit Philippine history in its natural setting in Southeast Asia, and consequently to really know the Philippines' history, culture, and heritage. So live from the United States of America, Dr. Bernardita Reyes Churchill.
Good evening. It is evening here. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction by EA. Let me warn you that I have a lot to cover, and I will have to go very fast in order that I will not be told to shut up eventually. A country with a diversity of peoples and cultures as the Philippines has a rich history and a wealth of cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, that should be treasured by all who call themselves Filipinos. There is no question the value of cultural heritage is celebrating the history of the people and in defining their modern history, their identity. The modern day Filipino, and I refer to you and me, looks Asian, but acts seemingly very Western. Look at our attire, observe our mannerism and behavior, notice the trappings of modern civilization all over the place. Look at our electronic gadgets. Even the body language is Western, so we think. So do some Westerners think about us, and even some Asians. The history and culture that seem to be more in the consciousness of Filipinos is their historical experience with the West, mainly the 333 years of Spanish colonial rule, that is Christianity, educational system, cultural forms and traditions, and almost half a century of American colonial rule. In the countries of Southeast Asia that I have visited, the wearing of traditional dress is still very visible. Naturally, I came wearing a vestida. That was fine in most places until I went to Myanmar. And I stood out like a sore thumb because I was the only woman walking around tourist spots, mainly Buddhist temples, wearing a dress, a mini dress attire at that. I should have worn a long skirt, a saya, or a malong, but I didn't know that this was necessary. I lived in Indonesia for 4 years, and I have traveled all over Asia. But I'm always Chinese in China, or Shanghai Chinese, Indonesian in Indonesia, although they refer to me as somebody who is from the outer islands in the Moluccas, from Manado, because I'm lighter in complexion and my Indonesian accent of Bahasa is not what is spoken in Jakarta. I was Thai in Thailand, I was Malay in Kuala Lumpur. The only exception, I think that I was mistaken for an indigene, was in Burma or Myanmar because I was not wearing a longji. I will only slightly make some reference to the Western influences in our culture. The result of 400 years of Western colonial rule. You are more familiar with them than with the other layers of Filipino culture. The others I have in mind are the Asian layers, which seem to have been submerged by later foreign cultural influences. I would therefore like to look at the pre-Spanish cultural roots of the Filipino and discuss our historical experience in the context of our Asian roots. When I was teaching, I'm retired now, when I was teaching Philippine History and Institutions 1, which is the basic course for all students entering the University of the Philippines, my first lesson is asking a volunteer to draw the map of the Philippines on the board. I do not get very many volunteers. Their answer is, "Ma'am, hindi naman kami artist, hindi kami marunong mag-drawing." So I tell them, di na bale kung pangit ang drawing ninyo. Basta ilagay lang ninyo how you look at what the Philippines is like on a map. Diyan yung lahat ng 7,100 islands. So somebody comes, or if nobody comes, I volunteer somebody to come and make the drawing. The next assignment, the next person I ask is, draw the countries that are closest to the Philippines. I say this because kung sakasakali lumubog ang bangka ninyo, lumubog ang island ninyo, saan kayo pupunta na pinakamalapit? You should see that map that they will draw. Hindi nila alam ang Taiwan, hindi nila alam ang Indonesia, pahula-hula sila din. Anyway, and then you ask them, saan kayo? You ask them, saan ang US, saan ang Australia, saan ang Europe? More or less, alam nila kaliwa kanan, west or east. So I think it is an indication of how little we know or try to know about our country. The archipelago extends over 1,000 miles off the coast of Asia, from Taiwan in the north to within a few miles of Sabah in the south, forming the western rim of the China Sea. Most of the more than 7,000 islands are small and uninhabited, with 95% of the population living in the 12 largest islands. And the Christians I'm not going to go into this. You know where the Christians are, you know where the indigenous peoples are all over the country, and you know where the Muslims are. With the exception of the remnant Negrito and the mixed groups, with Chinese and other Asians and Westerners, the people of the Philippines are racially called Austronesians, formerly Malayo-Polynesian. similar in physical appearances to other peoples of Asia, of island Southeast Asia, as I already pointed out. The more than 70 distinct languages spoken by these peoples are also referred to as Austronesian or Malayo-Polynesian, lately called Nusantao, and are mostly closely related to the peoples and languages of Malaysia, Indonesia, Champa in the mainland Southeast Asia, and the outlying Pacific islands. The Philippines island world has for thousands of years received past peoples and cultural influences, going back some 40,000 years when people used Asian land bridges which linked Indonesia in the south and Taiwan and Asia in the north. Subsequently, small groups of seafarers coming from Indo-Malayan and Indo-Chinese coasts gradually populated the archipelago. Various cultural forms then developed in response to changing ecological and demographic conditions. Roughly 500 years before the arrival of the Portuguese and Spaniards in the Philippines in the early 16th century, Chinese, Hindu, Indonesian, and Arab traders and missionaries had come. Islam gained ascendancy in the outer islands by the 1400s. Spanish conquest and Christianization began in 1565 and lasted for 333 years until 1898. The American colonial occupation lasted for almost 50 years, with a brief interruption of the Japanese occupation during the Pacific War. Incidentally, the fantastic, for me, dramatic PowerPoints were made by Dayun, Professor Zamora. Okay. The historic influences that have entered the archipelago account for the seeming diversity of peoples, languages, and cultural forms, which can be seen in more than 70 distinct cultural groups speaking different languages and an even bigger number of dialects and sub-dialects. A closer study will reveal similarities or commonalities that are shared with the larger framework of Southeast Asia. Similarities can also be found among the lowland cultures and various culture types in the interior highlands that point to an older base common to much of Southeast Asia. I had a very interesting experience when I visited Yunnan in China, which is the farthest from Beijing, where a large cultural community of what we call indigenous peoples live. And because it was unusual from what you see in Beijing or what you see in Shanghai, on market day, which was a Sunday, I decided to position myself at the bottom of a hill because people were coming from the uplands, higher elevation, to go down to the market. And I positioned myself there because I was fascinated by all the peoples that were coming down, dressed in indigenous costumes or clothes, which resembled the clothes that we have in the Philippines, our ikat. The baskets were the same. The way they carry the baskets on the head were the same. And I kept saying, meron kami niyan eh. Ganyan din sa amin. I kept saying that because I was amazed how closely they resemble all of us. And also, in a trip to Taiwan and Thailand, we went to what was the equivalent of Nayong Filipino. And there you see the villages, you see the people, and I was saying the same thing. Meron kami niyan sa Philippines. Meron kami nito, meron kami ganyan. So you can see where our roots really lie. The noticeable commonalities are found in the nature and characteristics of local settlements in scattered villages where live persons linked by kinship ties, in the leadership of men of prowess, possessed with charisma and the symbols of authority, evidence in headdress, and you can see attire and ornamentation, ceremonies and rituals performed to appease the spirits and deities, trade with Chinese, which introduced wealth from agriculture, especially rice, in land being considered as the basis of political influence, prestige, and power, in Islamization in Mindanao and Sulu, and Hispanization and Christianization in Luzon and the Visayas. This brief outline explains the major historical processes that have resulted in what has been described as both the cultural amalgam of lowland peasant society and the cultural diversity among upland groups, two of the more important facets of contemporary Philippine life. Filipino culture is many hundreds of years old, antedating the arrival of Spaniards in 1521 and the beginnings of Spanish colonization in 1565. As Robert Fox, an anthropologist, said, the traits of traditional pre-Spanish heritage continue to form the foundation of contemporary life. The traditional culture was a synthesis of three mainstreams: the Austronesian or Malay, the Chinese, and the Indian. By the 15th century, there existed in the archipelago, based mainly on archaeological evidence in Butuan, Calatagan, Tabon, Cagayan Valley, and you'll hear all of this in the second paper, and records of neighboring countries like China, India, and Southeast Asia. Cultures and societies which were unique and distinct linguistically, culturally, and socially speaking from neighboring peoples of Asia. The lineal village or barangay was the main feature, generally small, scattered, located near the sea or along the rivers, growing later into large nucleated communities, with each one forming a political, social, and economic entity along a recognizable pattern. The strong family unit is a focal point of society, with kinship relationships extended through marriage and leadership in and with authority vested on family heads and elders was another. Religious beliefs included a hierarchy of deities who lived in sky worlds and underworlds. The even stronger notion that the dead continued to guide and interact with the living, as well as the host of environmental spirits, which were good or evil, depending upon man's daily relationship with them. The Indic syllabic script, the structure of communal life, native and imported, like Chinese, the imported ceramic art, behavioral patterns, beliefs, and values, all set them off as a distinct culture which was Filipino in every sense except in name. Archaeological remains and records of neighboring countries document the appearance of the contributions of the two great cultural streams of China and India. These elements of village society and culture, of ecology and economy, of colonial experience, and the frustrations of nation building and neocolonialism are features common to Southeast Asians, whether Filipinos, Thais, Burmese, Vietnamese, Indonesians, or Malays. If you were to take the indigenes from different countries of Southeast Asia and dress them all exactly alike, it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to identify the country of origin of each and all. This situation implies two things. There probably was a common Southeast Asian infrastructure among these various countries and peoples before the appearance of outside cultural streams. There probably were common contributions from other several cultural streams: Chinese, Indian, Arabic, and more recently Western, including Spanish, American in the case of the Philippines, adapted in the cultural milieu of each group of peoples. The play of diverse influences on the area have resulted in a very complex human pattern. The high degree of accessibility of the area, especially by water, its location between the two great culture worlds of India and China, its fringe role in relation to the densely settled of Eastern and Southern Asia, all these encourage a constant convergence of people on these southeastern fringes of Asia. From very early times, Chinese, Indian, and Arabic Islamic influences have been brought to bear on the Philippines, including in the area, including the Philippines. The peoples of Southeast Asia, in the course of their history, have absorbed in their cultural patterns certain imported elements, adjusting them to their own requirements and outlook, and in the process have developed a marked degree of individuality in each case. The process of adjustment demonstrates the strength and persistence of indigenous culture. By the beginning of the Christian era, the Malay population of the Philippines, later referred to as Indios by the Spaniards, the predominant physical type in the area, had occupied the principal river valleys and coastal plains of the entire region. Thus, when the Southeast Asia felt the earliest impact of Indian culture, it processed a civilization on its own, characterized by the following features. You will see some of these features in the archipelago. You have the material culture, cultivation of irrigated rice, domestication of ox and water buffalo, rudimentary use of metals, and skill in shipbuilding and navigation. Social system, importance of women and of the descent of the maternal line, an organization resulting from the requirement of irrigated agriculture, as seen in the barangay and other forms of village communities throughout the Philippines. With regards to the religion, belief in animism, the worship of ancestors, likha, larawan, and the god of the soil, bulol, and other spirits, anito. Location of shrines on high places, caves or hills, burial of the dead in jars or dolmens, raised horizontal stone slabs, a mythology imbued with a cosmological dualism of mountain versus sea, winged beings versus water beings, men of the mountain versus men of the seacoast. With regards to linguistics, the use of isolating languages with a remarkable facility for derivation by the use of prefixes, suffixes, and infixes. I have a strange story to tell with regards especially to the Indian and Hindu influences in Philippine culture. It can be fairly assumed that since the contacts of the Philippines were largely with areas which were bearers of Indian culture and religion in Southeast Asia, there would seem to be some presumptive evidence that the Philippines was exposed to the same influences which ultimately produced Hindu or Buddhist societies in the rest of Southeast Asia, except that the monuments found in the Empire States of island and mainland Southeast Asia are not to be found in the Philippines. We do not have a Borobudur, nor a Pambanan in Central Java, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, Pagan in Burma or Myanmar, or Ayutthaya in Thailand. Some of the features of an Indianized Philippines are the following. The Tagalog term for supreme being is Barhala, the Sanskrit word Batara or Batara. Ceremonies, sculptures, and epics. Mandalas, Tagalog and Kapampangan prayers and mysterious words. Mantras, magic formulas or prayers repeated for their efficacy by priests who were readers of the writings of gods and keepers of the religious tradition. Epics like Maharadya Lawana, Indarapata, Sulaiman, and the Sidai are extensive narratives recited or sung, presented in hours-long evening performances, a writing system India derived that was remarkably widespread. The early accounts also agree that the widespread literacy included the women as much as men. The Filipino writing system was commonly used for at least 250 years after the coming of the Spaniards. And there is a Jawi script in Mindanao and Sulu, which is still used. The probable origin of this Philippine script seems to have been South Celebes in East Indonesia. South Celebes fell into the suzerainty of Majapahit in Java, which speak from 1350 to 1389. If the Philippine script came from South Celebes, there seems little question that the introduction occurred at a time when the bearers of the script were strictly Hindu. I already pointed out the linguistic record, religious and ethical Tagalog, Visayas, Mindanao, Maguindanao, Ilocano have Sanskrit words, with Tagalog having more than Visayan or Ilocano. Some of this, as I said, Balhala, Hari, Karma, Diwata, Diwa, Sampalataya, Likha, Maharlika. One Indian custom among Filipinos which the Spaniards encountered was what appears to have been the Indio form of greeting, now vanished from the Philippines, although common elsewhere in Southeast Asia. This is the mode of salutation upon entering or meeting anyone, which is as follows. They drew the body together and make a low reverence, raising both hands to the face, like this, and placing them on the cheeks. That was quoted by Pedro Chirino. Illustrative of the present-day customs of beliefs which appear to be Indian-derived are that of the following: eating in silence and leaving a small portion of food on the plate. Not sleeping with wet hair because of the belief that it will cause sickness or blindness or even madness. The idea that a major construction work requires a human sacrifice. Now we use coins on the foundations of houses and buildings. and throwing of water on passers-by on particular religious days, now adapted to the celebration of the feast of St. John the Baptist. And folk believes that when a person dreams his teeth have fallen out, one of his friends or relatives would die, and a thorn in one's throat can be cured by a cat's paw. I guarantee you the efficacy of that cure because I have tried it on a colleague, and she was really, I'm not going to mention her name, and we found a cat and it worked. Believe it or not. Many traditions, customs, modes of dressing, architectural art, brass, and copperware are Indian influence. As I said, we did not get Indian influence directly from India. We did not have Indian settlers in the Philippines. Neither were there in Southeast Asia. What they had were Malays, Indonesians, and other Southeast Asians who traveled to the places in India and brought back with them the culture, especially the religion of that area. When I was my first exposure to Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian history, aside from having taken a course at UP before I graduated, was a course in Southeast Asian history at Cornell University. And I had the good fortune of having Professor D.G.E. Hall as my professor on Southeast Asian history, the very author of that huge volume on Southeast Asian history. In my time, I was there. I'm not going to tell you when. You're going to compute how old I am. I'm just going to tell you how old I am sometime. Okay, at that time, the book that we used for Southeast Asia, a history of Southeast Asia, a thick book, which I used in UP, did not include the Philippines. Certainly not in the pre-colonial, not in the traditional period. And I was a new student. I was young. I was a foreign student. I was very shy. I, of course, did not question the authority on Southeast Asia as to why the Philippines was not included in the pre-colonial period, but we were included towards the end during the nationalism period. But subsequent Filipino students at Cornell apparently complained and said, "Bakit naman? Why aren't we included?" And his comment was, that's why I asked for you to draw the map. His comment was, if you take a look at the map of Southeast Asia, you will see that the route of Indian cultural influences from India to island and mainland Southeast Asia stop in the Indonesian archipelago because the Philippines is not in that waterway directly for Indian influences or Indian cultural contacts between India and Southeast Asia. Papanik ka pa sa itaas sa norte. That was the explanation I was giving. We were not in the path of the sea travel that was common in that area. However, I know someone very closely, especially my husband, who decided that he did not agree with this and decided to do his own research on Southeast Asian, on the influence of India on the Philippines. And of course, you have to rely on all the works of Johnny Francisco. My husband wrote an article, Indian Penetration of the Pre-Spanish Philippines, and you look at evidence published in the Asian Studies in 1977, where he pointed out, of course, we didn't have the Borobudur, of course, we didn't have the Angkor Wat, but there were Indian influences in the Philippines. Well, if you have the time, you can look it up. Now, I'm not going to go into more detail. I have a lot of materials for you to read if you really want to do all of this. Then I go now to Chinese cultural influences in the Philippine culture. You are more familiar with this and probably the Indian influences, and you certainly should have read all the writings of Tessie Angsi and Richard Chu on this matter, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that. I just want to point out that archaeological findings point to the Chinese influences in the Philippines very, very early in the late Tang period, about 10th century AD. Now, in one of my visits to academic visits to China, I was given a book written in Chinese, of course, about dynastic histories, Chinese dynastic histories, which mention the Philippines. And one of my academics I met told me that it really goes as far back as the Sui dynasty. even before the Tang Dynasty. Tessie, I think, Tessie's probably around. Tessie and I had told Tessie that it is probably about time that this book is translated, so that we'll know about the records on the Philippines, as well as a book on the history of the Philippines in Chinese, which also should be probably translated so we can read about it. Okay. I'm going to go now to Islam, but this is also another aspect of Philippine history that you should know. You should know about Islam in the Philippines. You should know when Islam came to the Philippines. I have here from around the end of the 13th century, there were already settlements of foreign Muslims in the southern islands, as well as extensive commercial relations between the Islamic world of Southeast Asia and what was then the Philippine archipelago. I also have a lot of materials on this that can be read for your information. So let me just go in bits and pieces of it. Islamization of Mindanao commenced in the early 16th century when the Sharif Muhammad Kabungsuan established himself in the Cotabato Malabang area, and through a combination of diplomacy and conquest secured the allegiance of the Maguindanao and Iranon people. From there, Islam spread along the coast from northern Mindanao to the Gulf of Davao and inland to Lake Lanao and Bukidnon. In the 16th century also, Islam began expanding from Borneo to Balabac Island, Palawan, Mindoro, Lubang Island, and southern Luzon. The Sulu and Maguindanao Sultanates were the first supra-barangay political institutions in the Philippines. The chiefs of Manila and its sister settlement of Tondo across the Pasig River were also to convert to Islam. Owing to their locations astride the seaways of religious trade and political expansion in Southeast Asia, these settlements became centers of trade. Cebu in the central Visayas was the principal port in the region, with the harbor protected by Mactan Island. By the time the arrival of the Spaniards in the 16th century, Muslim settlements were noted in Lubang Island and Mindoro. 1573, 3 Muslim settlements were found in Luzon. Muslims were noted in Betis and Lubao in Pampanga in 1576, and Muslim preachers from Borneo were reported in Balayan and Taal in Batangas. By the middle of the 16th century, the Philippines was thus in the process of becoming part of the wider Darul Islam, abode of peace in Southeast Asia. Jolo became the center of a trading center network which extended west to Java and north to China, and maritime and political alliances linked Sulu and Mindanao and the Muslim enclaves in the north with other states from Borneo or Kalimantan to the Moluccas or Maluku. Because of its geographical centrality, Jolo and Tawi-Tawi became historically important foci for trade, culture, and politics. Okay, I'm not going to go into the records because these are all available and in print, but I think just want you to understand that it is important for us to know the history of of the Muslims in the Philippines and how they have to be always be a part of us. Now, let me go to the next session, the next period. I'm going to talk about Magellan's voyage to the Philippines. This is the historic first voyage of globalization. Seeds of change and seeds of exchange, old world and new world. We can probably safely say that one of the greatest events in the history of mankind was the age of these great discoveries, when massive changes were brought about as a result of the contacts of old and new worlds. As a writer calls this one of the great collisions of human history. The story of the encounters between peoples of different nations, races, and religions of the old world of Europe and the new world of the Americas changed the cultural, biological, environmental, and technological landscape of practically all regions of the modern world, not only in the immediate aftermath of the voyage of discoveries, but up to this day. The world has never been quite the same. The voyages of discovery during this great age undoubtedly had tremendous consequences in bringing about these changes and spark what we may consider the first globalization associated with the exchange of cultures and ideas. You know about the Magellan expedition, and I'm just going to look at it in my own, looking at it from a different angle. Let us now revisit Magellan's voyage to the Philippines and take a different look at Philippine history during the period of from 1500 to 1800, away from the narrow perspective of island history to a broader view of the Philippines in the context of a wider Asian history. In so doing, we will learn how the Philippines played out its relations with neighbors in Asia, the New World of Mexico, and later Spain, in the period of its supposed isolation during the first 200 years of Spanish rule, something that does not figure in Philippine historical writing. This is a perspective that goes against the grain of Philippine historiography, which has tended to be more focused on what was happening to the Filipinos, rather than what was happening to the Philippines in the context of the colonial affairs of Spain and other European powers in East and Southeast Asia. There might be some historians who will consider this as a step backward, but I feel that there is no place for extreme ethnocentrism that is sometimes evident in Philippine historical writing. We should also remedy the narrow vista that informs the teaching of Philippine history that deprives the Filipino student of the knowledge to be able to relate the Philippines to a broader Asian context. The European age of discovery set the stage for the changes and exchanges which have characterized relations among lands and peoples in the known world, and which have engaged and transformed Europe, the Americas, and Asia in the era of discoveries from 1500 and before the period of imperialist interventions in the high colonial age of the 19th century. I would like to focus on the consequences and repercussions of the Magellan voyage on the historical development of the Philippines and the Filipinos. In my view, the arrival of Magallanes to the Philippines had the immediate effect of bringing to the areas that he visited European or Iberian, Spanish Portuguese culture, while he and his men, as noted in Antonio Pigafetta's account, were introduced to the culture of the people of these islands. If one reads his account, Pigafetta stood in awe of some of the cultural practices he noted among the people of the archipelago, not always sympathetically, just as his Cebuanos were impressed, puzzled with wonderment at this strange-looking group of white men who seemed to be disposed to fire their cannons at every opportunity. The Magallanes expedition was big news in Spain, made even bigger by the feat of the first circumnavigation of the globe, even if it was not the noble captain himself who had accomplished this. The Victoria even brought a small cargo of cinnamon and mace, samples of the much coveted spices from the Indies, realizing a meager 4% from the investment in the voyage. It also confirmed the existence of a southwestern route to the Indies and raised hopes for Spanish claims to the Spice Islands. Eventually, the rest of Europe, as far as the accounts of the expedition became available, learned of the Philippines and other places in this part of the world. The Pigafetta account is considered a key source in Philippine historiography in the words of a Philippine scholar. The Magallanes expedition stayed in the Philippines for about 7 months. The voyage took 3 years, and the section on the Philippines is its centerpiece, consisting of a third of the entire account, including 23 painted maps, 9 of which are of the Philippine Islands, representative of brown islands in a blue ocean. It is rich in ethnographic data of the places visited in the Philippines and elsewhere, and should really be studied for its first printed source for the history of some of the islands in 1521. Some of his observations are revealing. He wrote that there was gold in the island, that Cebu traded with China, India, and Siam, and that people loved peace, ease, and quiet. It should be pointed out that there have also been other accounts of the Magallanes expedition published in recent times, and a comparison of the ethnographic data found in them would be interesting and useful for the reconstruction of this pre-Spanish period in Philippine history. Let me point out here that Portuguese chroniclers also produced some of the earliest works on the Philippines in the 16th century that have recorded the beginnings of the relations between the people of these Filipinas islands and the Portuguese who came to the Indies ahead of the Spaniards. These chronicles also contain important ethnographic data on the peoples of the islands and can be useful to reconstruct Philippine conditions at this time. In other words, what has been missing in Philippine historiography until now is the history of the contact of the indigenous peoples of this archipelago with the first Europeans to arrive in Southeast Asia, that is, the Portuguese. And believe it or not, from these connections that we have with the Iberian countries, I was sent at one time, this is in 2011, to my surprise, Jose Carlos Brandi Alexio sent me a book, Relations Between Brazil and the Philippines, an Overview. Obviously, this is related to the presence of Spaniards of the Philippines and everything about the Philippines and Mexico with the galleon trade, which was not only for Mexico, but it was for all South America, Spanish America, as well as for Europe. Okay. Now, let me go into, since this is more or less a historiographic paper, let me go into mention two sources, very early sources that are good sources for the Philippines. I will mention the Boxer Codex, which is a late 16th century manuscript discovered by Charles Boxer in 1947, purportedly made in Manila using presumably rice paper and Chinese paints of the Ming period. The Codex, 97 pages, were probably the earliest descriptions of the culture and peoples of Southeast Asia and East Asia, and also included drawings of Chinese deities and fabulous animals. It was written throughout in Spanish with some Chinese characters in the captions. The authorship still uncertain, probably Spanish. Spanish scholars consider the Codex one of the oldest European manuscripts about the Philippines and some of its Asian neighbors. The Philippine ethnic groups are depicted in vivid colors with remarkable fidelity, in the opinion of Quirino and Garcia, wearing gold ornaments in reference to gold artifacts found in the Philippines. It may be considered as the first general history of East Asia, according to a Spanish historian friend of mine. The manuscript, Charles Boxer's manuscript, is found in the university in Bloomington in Indiana. And I visited, my husband and I visited that. I was invited as speaker in the Department of History of Indiana University. And one of the things I said I would not leave Bloomington without doing is going and see the Boxer Codex. It's in that library. Our experience is you go inside the library, they bring you the Boxer Codex. You have to wear gloves. There's a stand, so you touch it, and my husband and went through every single page of the Boxer Codex. I happen to have a PDF file in my library in UP Village, which is the original, a copy of the original of the Boxer Codex. It's been written a lot. The first issue was published in the Journal of Science in the Philippines, but it was only the portion on the Philippines. The quincentennial of the Philippines in 2021, in relation to the Magellan expedition, is being commemorated with a flurry of academic undertakings with the end in view of looking back to rethink and appraise the long colonial relations. 333 years from 1565 to 1898, longer if you use 1571 as a point of reference, that is 377 years, as some people are wont to do. They need to reassess the relevance and consequences of this long historical period in the relations of the Philippines and Spain. This is commendable because studies from both Spain and the Philippines have really been scarce and few between. The biggest stumbling block is language. Very few Filipino historians and researchers are able to undertake archival research because of the lack of facility in Spanish. On the part of the Spanish historians on the Philippines, their works in Spanish hardly reach the Philippines and cannot be read by Filipinos who do not have the facility with the language. In both cases, researches have been carried out independent of each other. For Filipino historians, few Filipino historians are able to do research in Spain, and the reverse is true for Spanish historians. So what the Department of History is doing now, looking at the colonial period, the early colonial period with the end, with the quincentennial, is really a very worthwhile undertaking. The revised curriculum for undergraduate and graduate degrees in history now requires some units in Spanish, not a popular decision for tertiary institutions and prospective history majors, so I have been told, in the hope and wish that history majors would be able to undertake research in this language. If the curriculum is complied with by colleges and universities with history programs, then we should make some progress. CHED should see to that. I'm aware of this because I chair the technical committee for history of CHED, which revised the program, and I introduced this, along with other subjects that will fill in the gaps in our history, in our study of the history of the country. The other material that I would like you to be aware of is the Doctrina Christiana for this very early period, the first book printed and published in the Philippines. The unique surviving copy is in the Library of Congress, and irreplaceable and priceless. This time, the Library of Congress will bring out, this was in one of our sessions, the historian will bring out the copy, the only copy they have, put it down in a lectern. Nobody could touch except the librarian, but at least we know where it is. It is unique, it is of unique historical and linguistic significance for the Filipinos, Spaniards, and Chinese whose techniques and people physically produced the book. So it is something that is worth looking at, even if I think this is a reproduction, a reprint of the National Historical NHCP, then at the time National Historical Institute. This is the way it looks. Now, a few works on Filipinos were written by non-religious authors. Many of the writings on this very early period of Spanish colonial period were written by friars, chroniclers of the friar orders. So I will just mention two. I would mention Antonio de Morga, which I'm sure you know already, Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas in 1609, usually regarded as the earliest Spanish history of the Philippines. However, there is an almost entirely neglected unknown manuscript in the Lilly Library in Bloomington, Indiana, where the Boxer Codex is. That significantly predates Morga. The manuscript was noted by the Franciscan archivist Father Lorenzo Perez in the 1930s, but passed over by Charles Boxer. It seems to be the earliest history of the Philippines, covering the period from 1564 to 1596. What is more remarkable is that unlike all the other early histories except Morga, it appears that it was written not by a priest, but by a layman, quite possibly a soldier. It is largely an eyewitness account. The unpublished manuscript, I understand, is in the process of being translated, according to John Crossley, and I hope he finishes his translation before it's too late for me to see it. The manuscript, looking back at how I studied Philippine history in UP, I am amazed that to this day, I still remember what he learned about pre-Spanish indigenous society and culture, using 4 translations into English of portions of 4 books written in the 16th century. We were assigned to read materials which describe Manila in Morga, Luzon Tagalog in Plasencia, Visayas in Miguel de la Huarca, who was an encomendero in Panay, and Mindanao for Father Colin. These were translations printed in our textbook. Readings in Philippine history, 611 pages for 1 semester. The translations were taken from Blair and Robertson, and what we had to read were in the main missionary chronicles of the orders assigned in the conversion of the Indios. The missionary chronicles, I have a long section here, and at the end, bibliographic note of Phelan's book, you will see a list of all these missionary chronicles as well as a description. I would now like to go into, because I know I have exceeded my time, but I'm going to go very fast. And I just point out some of the things I want to point out here. When we talk about Spain in the Philippines, and we talk about Spanish influence in the Philippines, we seem to have forgotten that we had 2 centuries of relations with Mexico. So the great distance, the distance between Spain and the Philippines was too much. Mexico was a viceroyalty, and we were governed from Mexico. So let me briefly relate to you. This again is one thing that is greatly missed, greatly missed or ignored by Filipino historians. And this is a puzzlement, considering that relations existed for 250 years, and archival records in the Philippines and Mexico are quite voluminous. So in many instances, when we say Spanish, we probably mean Mexican, because it was not until the 19th century, after Mexico became independent from Spain in 1821, that direct relations were established between the Philippines and Spain. Okay, let me just cite very quickly some of the things that we think may have been directly from Spain, but really they were actually from Mexico. I will mention here the pattern, the grid pattern of pueblos, like Parilla or Gridiron or Tablero or Dama, with the main square with two major plazas. Mexican religious images. We have the Cristo Negro and the Virgin of Antipolo. Christmas also comes with a Mexican flavor, Misa de Aguinaldo, Misa de Gallo. And you have the piñata, which is probably where we got the idea of the farol. And of course, it's the fragrant calachuchi and the poinsettia or the pascua. Spanish words abound in Philippine languages, including the Mexican Spanish pronunciation of caballo, which came from in Sibuyas, Syria. Then there is Chabacano, Español de Tienda, spoken in the port de Cavite City, where galleons docked upon arrival in Filipinas, and in Zamboanga, where Spanish and Mexican soldiers were stationed in Fort Pilar and elsewhere in the archipelago. The institution of compadrazgo or compadre system also came from Mexico, and also nanay and tatay, for mother and father. There is also a considerable contribution from Mexican flora: corn, maize, sweet potatoes, cassava, manioc, tobacco, cacao, papaya, guava, avocado. I think you know all of that. A Mexican scholar graphically described this exchange in the following words, and this I think is interesting. When you speak about zacate and petates, when the women of the barrios go into the tiangue and buy sintama and chico, when they cook atole, tamales, and champurrado, when the compadre comes into the house and especially is respected by all the family, when the middle of the great Easter celebrations in Marinduque and other places see the penitentes scourging their backs, you are living as yours by right, that great popular transculturation. And in Mexico, when the people go to the fiesta of the patron saint of the village and watch with eyes full of wonder the colored glory of fireworks, when they bet and haggle and imagine all kinds of tricks in the cockpit, and in the plaza they eat the delicious mango de Manila, those peoples from Mexico are living, perhaps unknowingly, the great process of transculturation that began 400 years ago and ended in 1850. I'm going to skip the rest of my paper because I would like to go to the end, and that is that to me is more important. And with the admonition to you, please pay attention to the Philippines in Southeast Asia. I became exposed, as I said, when I took the course, and since then I have looked out for books that are general history of Southeast Asia. Where would the Philippines be? In most instances, the Philippines is hardly mentioned until the books of Anthony Reed and Victor Lieberman came out, which included finally the Philippines. If you take a look at some of the books I have on Southeast Asia, all you will see in the index and in the bibliography, I have highlighted everything that mentions the Philippines, and sometimes I get very frustrated because the Philippines is very seldom mentioned. One of the things we also are not familiar with or not go into is the 18th century in the Philippines. This is the forgotten long century in the Philippines. British occupation, 1762 to 1764, economic reforms of Governor Vasco Vargas, and other commercial and economic developments during this period. You are familiar with the PNHS mission to look into local history and going into the local history in the context of national history. I would like to do one final, and that is enhancing the teaching of Philippine history, culture, and heritage, and creating an exclusive history to include martial law, the history of the Muslims and indigenous peoples. You are familiar, I hope, with the laws that were passed recently last year by Congress, which precisely provides for the mandatory study of Bangsamoro history, culture, and identity in the curricula of all levels of schools in the country. And after subject matter, they include the subject of moral history, culture, and identity, and mandate, and the subject also of the indigenous peoples. I agree with this. I actually sent a position paper to this to Congress when we were asked by Chair to do so. And I hope that all history programs in the Philippines will adopt, you will follow this, and also follow the CHED revised history curriculum, which includes all of the subjects, including Spanish. If CHED enforces compliance with these laws, my conclusion is there will be no people without history in the Philippines. Thank you. I'm sorry it took so long, but I had a lot to say. Thank you.
Maraming salamat po, Dr. Churchill, sa very thorough and very informative na discussion on the Philippine history. No? I'm sure nawindang tayo, no, sa very very informative, no, yung presentation ni Dr. Churchill. So thank you very much, ma'am, for that presentation. And also, we would just like to, or we will go to the question and answer portion of this, of Ma'am Churchill's presentation. And parang Miss Universe lang, ano. Anyway, yung first question from Felix Rodriguez. Our understanding of colonialism assumes that our identity springs from outside influences, that we are passive receivers of foreign ideas and customs. Could you please address how colonizers themselves were indigenized?
But that's how colonized. Are you talking about Spaniards, Mexicans, Spaniards, Americans? What do you mean by the colonizers?
Okay, let's ask Sir Rodriguez to clarify his question. Okay, if any of those, that's his answer.
Well, I didn't see the comment. I didn't see that.
It's on the chat box.
Hindi ako marunong magbukas niyan.
I'll read it for you, ma'am. He said, could you please address how colonizers themselves were indigenized? Like any of our colonizers?
Well, if you are looking at, you are thinking of how the Spanish colonizers attuned themselves to what was going on in the Philippines because they were living in the area, I wouldn't be surprised if they would also eat some of our foods, accept some of our customs. But I don't think that I can actually cite specific instances to validate that. It does seem to be sensible anyway to think that eventually those who do not look down on the indigenous culture and those who might appreciate some of the aspects of our culture might have found that it was good to also live the way Filipinos do or think the way Filipinos did. But this is a very, very big assumption. I really have nothing to go by, Felix. I'm sorry to say that. We can talk about it another time.
Thank you, ma'am. Also, another question here. This is actually more of a recurring question on the Philippines, particularly structures that we have here. Comparing it to our neighbors here in Southeast Asia, bakit po walang like monumental pre-colonial structures ang Pilipinas? Kagaya po ng Indonesia, halimbawa. Ano po kaya ang dahilan?
Okay, alam mo, medyo malalim itong kasaysayan nito. I really have no specific issue as to why we do not have any we do not have the Borobodors or the Parmanans or the Angkor Wat. Definitely no. We were a small country with little barangays. Whereas if you look at Angkor, it was a huge community with a million population. We did not have that kind of resources. We also were not a contiguous territory. But that is a very simple explanation. In order to build the monuments that you find in other countries in Southeast Asia and the Indianized countries, you need a population of you need a population of 1 million people, at least not in my readings. Okay, I see something from Father. You have the rice terraces. So I'm not discounting, but what I think is being asked is why do we not have monuments? The rice. My understanding is why is there no let's say you have a monument of Rizal, why is there nothing of the others, of other aspects of our culture? Let me just go by my experience. When we celebrated the centennial of the Philippine Revolution against Spain in 1996, 1998, there was a committee. I was part of a committee which looked into possibilities of listing places where we could set up monuments to remind the people, tell the people about historical significance all over the country. We tried to put some in areas where there was none, like in Mindanao and Sulu or in the Cordilleras, but somehow that project did not push through. Now, Father Mike mentioned the rice terraces, but I'm talking about, I think the monuments that I cited had to do with the Indianized culture, and the rice terraces do not represent a religious, correct me if I'm wrong, a religious or in the same aspect as the Borobudur or Prambanan, which reflected Indian influence.
Okay, thank you po. Another questions actually, from Maria Agustina Raimundo. In conducting historical research, what is the primary step in gathering valid and reliable sources? That's number one. Number two, could you please give repositories of primary sources here in the Philippines? And the last one, what are the challenges that you have encountered in conducting your study?
Okay, we have the National Archives, and you can spend several lifetimes looking at the records of the National Archives, but there are not very many people who do that. One of the problems, of course, is language. You cannot, the materials are basically, especially during the colonial period, the materials are all in Spanish. A lot of the materials, there are manuscript primary documents, primary materials in the National Library. For example, I did a lot of research on the Quezon papers for my dissertation. In order to do research on the Japanese occupation for my MA degree, I was doing it in the Library of Congress because I was doing my degree abroad. So there are primary sources, manuscripts that you can find. The Vargas Museum has a very good Filipiniana. Personal papers of our leaders. The Malacanang Museum was supposedly a good museum before. I don't know what's happened to it. Manolo Quezon did a good job of gathering materials for people to do research during the colonial period. But if you're looking for lifetime research, plan to go to the National Archives, wherever they are located at this point. Religious, and Fire and Mike said, religious congregations also have UST. Excuse me, I didn't mean to UST archives. There are, and of course, all the religious orders have archives. I think there's one in what is the Franciscans who have it in San Francisco del Monte or something. Yeah. Okay. There are lots of materials. Historians and students of history can spend a lifetime looking at all these materials and looking at areas or topics that have not been explored and that we know very little of. Local history is also important, and you can go into, well, there are sometimes families who keep local records. So it's really a matter of deciding first what you want to write, and then we go and look and see where we can find the materials. We don't even think of going abroad because that is almost impossible, expense and all that. But plenty of materials to find in libraries and archives in the Philippines.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And we also have questions from Facebook. One is from Pot Bandal Fernandez. Is it possible that the Philippines is not frequently mentioned in Southeast Asian history because we are considered as a Spanish colony and not part of Asia?
Well, I think there is some element of truth in that. As I pointed out earlier, we are perceived as very Western because we act that way. Even our swagger, because we speak English, Kuno, and also because I have actually talked about this with some of my friends like Tony Reed, in Australia, and maybe it also has something to do with the fact that they do not see much being done in the Philippines of certain areas, certain aspects. I really can't give you a very good explanation on that. But somehow the Philippines seems to be out. The two that I mentioned, Lieberman and Tony Reed, have brought in the Philippines. I also have a number of sources in my paper where I pointed out where the Philippines comes in, but only minimal. And yet, I think we can play as much. We can say that we can play as much a role as the Indonesia or the other countries in Southeast Asia. I think we probably need to do a little bit more research, primary research on certain periods of our history that can be considered, that can be read by others. The exchange of materials is also important. We do not always have. I'm able to get materials of Southeast Asia because I did Southeast Asian history and I try to keep up with some of the literature, but that is not always the case. Even journals in the Philippines are not very extensive.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. We will entertain your other questions later. And for this session, I would just like to ask one more question for Dr. Churchill from Hammer Daginod on Facebook. Ma'am, why is it that some would say that the Philippines is one of the Indianized state?
Well, I don't know who said that the Philippines is one of the Indianized states. In fact, the reason is it's not considered, or at least DGE Hall didn't think so because he did not see the evidences of Indian culture in the Philippines that he saw in other countries of Southeast Asia. But he became convinced that maybe we didn't have the same kind of strength of influence. So we didn't have a Borobudur, we didn't have an Angkor Wat, but we certainly did get cultural influences from India via Indianized Malays, not directly from India. Our direct connection with India was in the British occupation in 1762 and 1764. And then, of course, trade, because of Seraphin Cason's British country trade. But we did not have the kind of cultural influence that the other Indianized states of Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, Burma, Malaysia, not so much Malaysia, but Burma, Thailand had. We didn't have that. And the reason for that, according to Professor Hall, was because we were outside the regular waterways that come from India to Southeast Asia. We have to go up to go to the Philippines. But that is not true, because we did get influences via Indianized Malays. We didn't get it directly from India.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you again for answering the questions, and thank you for your presentation. Let us show our appreciation to our speakers by typing mabuhay using the chat box. Again, thank you, Professor Churchill. Now, we are moving on to our next speaker to discuss research in the time of pandemic, the tale of Philippine archaeology. I'll be reading the abstract of her presentation. Doing research in archaeology allows one to contribute to the understanding of culture that belongs to a distant past that is bereft of people who can shed light on what happened a few hundred or thousands of years ago. One major component of archaeological research is fieldwork. Through collected material evidence that were left behind by people who live in the past, one gets a glimpse of how, why, what, and who produced the artifact. Everyone is familiar with stone tools, ceramic vessels, shell tools and ornaments, and even metal implements and ornaments. This is because archaeologists have shared their findings through publications that become proofs of what have been found in archaeological sites. Archaeologists are happy to do fieldwork, write their findings, and share them with widest possible audience. Nothing beats research based on fieldwork when everything is normal. But the pandemic reigns its ugly head and fieldwork becomes next to impossible. The lockdown forced most of us archaeologists and researchers to do the next best thing, which is work in the laboratory where previously collected artifacts are kept, or conduct archival and library research, or both. This researcher decided to look at the history of the Philippine archaeology by going through references and review the exciting chronology of events and personalities. This paper is focused on the last 25 years, as this is the period which coincides with the time that the author decided to become an archaeologist herself. The tale of Philippine archaeology has been written earlier by Alfredo Evangelista, Wilfredo Ronquillo, and Eusebio Dizon. This new period is being written as a contribution to the continuing existence of the discipline and its new heights it has achieved for the past 25 years, where I am part of. It is a broad account of individuals and institutions who have worked in the country's archaeological sites or participated in the analysis of finds that bear the cultural milieu of the archipelago. Ladies and gentlemen, to present her paper, here is Dr. Mary Jane Louise Bolunia.
Okay. Magandang umaga po. Good morning, everyone. I'm Mary Jane Bolunia, and I've been practicing archaeology for the last 25 years, including my graduate years at the University of the Philippines. So I'd be talking about the story of Philippine archaeology since the, shall we say, Spanish period, so that we have some historical background. Okay, I'll read first my prepared script so that we can situate everything. One of the disciplines greatly affected by COVID-19 pandemic is archaeology, particularly its fieldwork component. For colleagues in the social sciences like anthropology, going on fieldwork to interview and collect data is already difficult, and more so for archaeologists who have to stay in the field for at least a month. We cannot do fieldwork without close interaction with our local stakeholders and our laborers and volunteers, which would expose both of us to possible infection. This paper decided to focus instead on reviewing available resources, both hard copies of publications and those online that deal with Philippine archaeology and prehistory. I looked for recent publications that included work by local and foreign archaeologists as my contribution to enrich other people's papers and researches. Many times, students and researchers have a hard time finding possible sources about Philippine prehistory and archaeology. As I've earlier said, archaeology, like the other disciplines under anthropology, relies heavily on fieldwork. As an archaeologist, fieldwork allows us to contribute to the understanding of culture on the basis of actual material remains that we recover that belongs to a distant past, but bereft of people who can shed light on what happened hundreds or thousands of years ago. The importance of these collected material evidences gives us a glimpse of what, how, and why it happened in the past. While EA already mentioned that most of us are familiar with stone tools, ceramic vessels, shell tools, and even metal implements and ornaments, it takes the trained eyes and sound training and experience of an archaeologist to label them as such. This is because archaeology is a science with its own rigors that everyone who wants to be an archaeologist must follow. For us archaeologists, nothing beats a research based on fieldwork. That is when everything is normal. But since the pandemic made fieldworks impossible, we do the next best thing, which is to work in the laboratories and repositories for previously collected artifacts or do archival and library research or both. Archaeologist colleagues are now analyzing earthenware sherds, stone tools, which are quite difficult for a non-trained person or researcher to do that. And some are even measuring the differences in the human crania, while another is doing a rechecking of the raw material of our so-called jade ornaments. Archaeologists are happy to do field work, write our findings, and share them with the biggest possible audience. Between the fieldwork and publication, though, is a wide abyss consisting of laboratory work, discussions with colleagues, and then writing, of which is a more difficult task. One big question that was asked of me by one of my mentors is the lack of publications on Philippine archaeology and prehistory. I certainly agree to this observation because much of archaeological papers and researches are not always getting published. Many end up in government and private libraries because these are written more as technical reports that include jargons that others may not appreciate or understand. This paper pans the online sources that I think would benefit other researchers doing prehistory. Likewise, I go back to the earlier reports or papers written by archaeologists who try their best to narrate the story of Philippine archaeology from the Spanish period to 1995. So we start with Alfredo Evangelista, who started his summary by looking at the Spanish period to 1950. Then it was followed by Wilfredo Ronquillo from 1951 to 1981, and then 1998 to 2001. And then the last would be Eusebio Dizon from 1982 to 1992. Why did I say that Dizon is the last in terms of coming up with the history of archaeology, because their treatment of looking at the history of archaeology is more on the chronological way of doing it, whereas Victor Paz decided to come up with a different way of looking at it, like pre-archaeology to reflective archaeology. But the division that Dr. Paz used would still be from the Spanish period or even pre-Spanish down to the present times. And if one is to look at the Philippine archaeology, it would have been dominated by American anthropologists in the 1920s. So we are all familiar with H. Otley Beyer, Robert Fox, and Wilhelm or Bill Solheim. So here I just came up with some of the landmark publications that were written by these people that beneficial or would be useful for those who would like to work on prehistory and archaeology. Like, for example, the Outline Review of Philippine Archaeology by Islands and Provinces. From the title itself, you would already have an idea of how Beyer was able to map out the archaeological sites all the way from Batanes down to Mindanao, including Jolo. Then who would not know about Tabon Caves, because it is our first evidence for human presence in the Philippines. So that for a long time and even today, we're still using Tabon Caves by Fox as one of the major books when we discuss prehistory. Then, of course, if we go to the north, we have the preliminary report on the Paleolithic archaeology of Cagayan Valley, Philippines, and the Cabalwenian industry. Although most of us would be focusing on Cagayan Valley because it includes Kalinga, where the rhino remains that would have been butchered by a still unidentified person was discovered in 2014. And then the team of Dr. Mandy Mijares was able to identify remains in Calao Cave, now in Cagayan province, of another species of Homo, the Homo luzinensis. And then, of course, there is the book by Solheim that was published in 1964 and then revised and published in 2002 because it discusses the archaeology of central Philippines. Because if we try to look at the earlier report of Fox and Peralta, it would only be discussing Cagayan Valley as part of the Early Man project. So we go to Central Philippines, we have Solheim, and then another would be Archaeology and Culture in Southeast Asia, Unraveling the Nusantao. So this is also a good source material if you want to understand more about the Austronesian hypothesis. And then the migration or not migration, but the movement of the Austronesians and the role of the Philippines in that a big discussion that is going on not only among Filipino archaeologists and Southeast Asian archaeologists, but other people, other researchers who are also doing work in the Pacific and in other areas within the geographical consideration. Then from there, so you have here the Tabon Caves. If one is interested, this has been uploaded by the National Museum of the Philippines recently. So you can check the book and find yourself a copy. And this is for free. So you have there the Manunggul Jar as part of the discussion by Fox in his book, The Tabon Caves. And of course, another useful information for teachers and even for other researchers would be the more recent dating for the Tabon Cave find. So we have at least 3 remains of the early humans that inhabited Tabon. Then, of course, okay, so the discussion of Philippine archaeology would not be complete without mentioning the National Museum of the Philippines, because it was in 1901 that we have the National Museum, although it has gone through so many, how do you call that? It was established in 1901, then attached, detached, and then finally in 1998, 1997, it was under Republic Act 8492, it became a separate agency. So what is important with this discussion would be that the Anthropology Division of the National Museum of the Philippines was the oldest division under that agency. And it was, and during that time, the archaeology was just a section of the Anthropology Division. And you would have an idea, being a government agency, that people under that division, the Anthropology Division, would be doing not only archaeological work, but also anthropological or ethnological researches. So that in 1988, the Archaeology Division was separated from the Anthropology Division. And this time, there was an underwater archaeology section in the new division. And again, because of the thrust to further encourage more work, more researches in archaeology, the Maritime and Underwater Archaeology Division was established in 2017. So there are more people now doing archaeology researches in the country than before. And this is also one reason why you would be seeing more researches being done that is archaeological or prehistoric in nature. And then you see here the University of the Philippines as another important institution in making sure that archaeology is being studied. Although there is a Department of Anthropology in 1917, again, the thrust would be the four fields of anthropology as established by the American educational system. So that in 19, and then that would mean a very limited number of researches, because other people would also be doing ethnological, physical, anthropological research, and even linguistics, anthropological linguistic research. So that in 1995, together with the National Museum of the Philippines and the administration of the University of the Philippines in Diliman, they decided to establish the Archaeological Studies Program. And because of this, there is now a formal degree granting institution who can give us students who would like to pursue a graduate degree in archaeology. So they are now offering MA and MS in archaeology as well as a PhD in archaeology. So I will be discussing more about this in a little while. So just to give you an idea where the National Museum is, it's in the city of Manila. And then this is the University of the Philippines in Quezon City, and the distance is 15 kilometers. So if you want to do work, then that would mean a lot of sacrifices, given that commuting from Manila to Quezon City or Quezon City to Manila would mean going through a lot of traffic and pollution. But this work by the National Museum of the Philippines and the University of the Philippines was a step forward to move to further expand the practice of archaeology from land or terrestrial to underwater. Okay. Then from 1970s to the 1990s, there is a shift in the researches being done in the country because there are now more Filipino anthropologists because they finished their degrees in anthropology in the United States, like Mr. Evangelista finished his degree from the University of Chicago. Dr. Peralta from University of California, and then Dr. Hocano from the University of Chicago. So these are some of the anthropologists who were doing archaeology work, and they were able to publish articles and monographs that would become important in the study, or not only in the study of prehistory and archaeology, but also for sharing these papers with whoever would like to do prehistoric research. Because, mind you, as one colleague would say, we tend to destroy our source of information or source of data, because once you have excavated a site, you cannot always bring it back to its so-called pristine condition. So we have to be meticulously measuring, and then we have the so-called three-dimensional measurement, the depth, the north-south, and the east-west measurement, and then come up with the datum point where all measurements would come from or emanate. Then we also have Ronquillo and Dizon in the later part of the 70s to the 90s, who would be doing more archaeology as the earlier archaeologists would be retiring from the museum or maybe transferring to the University of the Philippines. So these are some of the publications that I think would be also helpful to those who would like to do more work in prehistory and archaeology. And somebody earlier was asking what would be a good book to check on Philippine prehistory and archaeology. One would be the anthropological overview of Hocano, or his more recent publication on this, which is, I think, a more, Dr. Hocano decided to revise his 1975 anthropological overview book with Filipino prehistory, rediscovering pre-colonial heritage. What is good with this book is that it is locally published, so it's easier to find than the others, which are mostly National Museum publications like Tigkiw na Saday by Dizon, the Technological and Functional Analysis by Ronquillo, and then Excavations at Santa Ana, Manila by Fax, and then, of course, The Soul Boat by Evangelista. Then likewise, although more Filipinos are doing archaeological work and doing service for establishing the prehistory of the Philippines, the country was not without its share of foreign archaeologists as research collaborators. But the only problem I think that I see then now is that there weren't many institutions that would be making collaborations with our foreign archaeologists. Although there are some, like for Hatterer, he would be doing work in Central Philippines and touch base with universities in Cebu, in Negros Occidental. And then for Longacre, it was still with UP that he did his Kalinga Ethno-Archaeological Project, aside from the National Museum. And of course, Professor Bellwood with UPASP and then the National Museum of the Philippines. Then again, I included here some of the landmark publications written by Hatterer, Houses Built on Scattered Poles, Prehistory and Ecology in Negros Oriental. Then the ethnoarchaeology at the top of the world by Longacre and his students Skibo and Stark. And then Raiding, Trading, and Feasting by Yanker, a student of Hatterer. And of course, this new book by Bellwood and Dizon as editors, The 4,000 Years of Migration and Cultural Exchange, the Archaeology of the Batanes Islands, Northern Philippines. So it tells us a lot more of what has been done in Batanes as a very important area for the movement of the Austronesian peoples. It's a bit tricky to be discussing the Austronesians unless you are also aware of the other hypothesis, the south to north hypothesis put forward by Solhan and his colleagues. So it's a very different way of discussing prehistory, and it's not easy for all of us. Okay? Then, because of the National Museum of the Philippines and the UP Archaeological Studies Program collaborative effort to come up with the program, there are now more joint researches before going independent. Like a good example would be the one done by Professor Victor Paz in the Palawan project. It was an original National Museum project in the early 1990s, or no, not in the 1980s. And then as Dr. Paz and his colleagues were able to do it on their own, the work now in Ili, and there are very good finds in that particular area for prehistory, are being done by Dr. Paz and his colleagues from UPASP and other foreign researchers. Then there are more graduates now who can do individual researches. Like students now are doing more work not in the usual stone tool, metal age or metal tools, and then earthenwares. There are now more, if I would be given the liberty, I would like to say that they are more into the non-usual topics, like doing work on obsidian flakes. It's not a stone, but it's a tool, but made of glass, something like that. Then another would be doing, instead of looking for the megafauna, she's now doing the micro mammals. Then the presence of local and foreign faculty members is also an addition to the movement forward, or the step forward to doing more research. So I have colleagues like Dr. Barreto, Dr. Neri, Dr. Mijares, and then the foreign colleagues who have been doing their own work from like doing work in Mindoro, doing work in Quezon, so things like that. And also the National Museum of the Philippines was able to come up with a National Museum Research Associate Program that invites, or that allows other individuals, other researchers to apply for this program and do their own research by presenting a proposal on what they would like to do if they want to work in the Philippines, and then in the field of archaeology and prehistory. And an additional source of data would be the archaeological impact assessments being done by colleagues who are more into trying to find out if these developmental projects, or the earth-moving activities being done by private individuals, companies, or even the government, who would like to put up the, let's say, for example, an extension of the PNR going to beyond, going again to, I think, La Union. So that would mean passing through a very long, passing through a big area, and then the archaeological impact assessment would be needed so that we can protect particular areas, or maybe document them if these are in danger of being destroyed by this developmental work. Okay, so this is a picture of the Cagayan Valley Archaeological Project in the 1970s. So you have here the National Museum doing its work in Madrigal and Espinosa. And it's part of the Early Man project that has been going on in the 1930s with colleagues from the United States, including geologists who have to look into the geological history of the area to be able to tell more how this megafauna, by the way, this would have been part of a large mammal during that time. So it's not very clear in the picture though. And then this is a picture of the early man site taken in 2017, I guess. So this is part already of the 2014 to 2019 archaeological project being shared with colleagues from the Musée National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, with ASP and the National Museum, and of course the local stakeholders from the provincial government of Cagayan down to the LGU of Kalinga. And this has been the site where the rhino fossil has been discovered. It's an almost complete rhino fossil. And then another good thing that you can maybe check your Google would be the Nature publication, wherein it was said there that the rhino has a date of 709,000 years ago upon its death because of the associated stone tools that they found. Then we also have collaborative work. Another colleague is doing work with Japanese colleagues from in doing work on the Shell Maiden site in Lalo. So instead of just focusing on the pottery and the burials, Dr. Garang now is doing work on isotope analysis. So these are some of the publications done by colleagues from 2002. So you have Dr. Mijares doing the lithic technology or stone tool technology from Minori Cave in Peña Blanca. Then Dr. Paz doing rock shelters and caves and archaeobotany because that's his specialization, one of his specialization, archaeobotany. And then Dr. Cairon decided to be a faculty, and he said, although he's not doing research per se, he's telling his students how to understand more Philippine archaeology and Philippine prehistory, and he even brings them to the Palawan area museum of the National Museum so that they will have an idea of what they should be proud of. So he wrote Stringing the Past, an archaeological understanding of early Southeast Asian glass bead, because he found thousands of black beads inside a jar from a sunken ship. And then, of course, Dr. Barreto Tisori is a prolific writer, and one of the earliest publications of Dr. Barreto would be The Identity and Reciprocity in 15th Century Philippines. So Dr. Garong's book is on carbon and nitrogen stable isotope analysis using human bones and hair from Philippine burial sites. Yes, it's possible to know what you've eaten given Dr. Garong's specialization by looking at your hair, and sometimes I'm not very sure with the teeth, but for the hair, it's very true. And then I did a short article on the excavations in Butuan in 2015. So here are sample publications that our audience could look into, of course. Thank you very much to PNHS for always welcoming archaeologists and prehistorians like me to be part of the issues of the Journal of History. Yeah, it's one of the best read journals in Asia. Then we also have dedicated journals like Hukay, published by the Archaeological Studies Program in UP Diliman. Then, of course, this Asian Perspectives. It was founded by Solheim, so you would get to see that it goes around not only in islands Southeast Asia, but also the Pacific in discussing archaeology. So you get to see colleagues being published in the Asian Perspective. Another would be the Journal of Antiquity, where colleagues have also published about the human remains found in Mindoro. Then these are some of the books. I hope Dr. Churchill is still here. So we have the Southeast Asia from Prehistory to History by Ian Glover and Peter Bellwood. The Philippines is discussed at least extensively in this book. And of course, this is the book by Solheim, Archaeology and Culture in Southeast Asia, Unraveling the Nusantao. And then this book edited by Chunming Wu is about the early navigation in the Asia Pacific. And then it included the articles written by a colleague in the Underwater Archaeology Division, Bobby Aurelianeda. So he discussed 15th century blue and white. And of course, Dr. Dison's paper on the San Diego. And another book that I think you would really love to look into would be The Paths of Origin, discussing how, again, the Austronesians would have moved around using material evidences. So this is a Lingling O. The source material or the raw material is nephrite, and so far the Philippines has not found any source for nephrite. Then one of my advocacies is to make sure that students are being brought to archaeological sites. I invite teachers whenever I have field works, when we have already established the excavations, to bring students so that they become aware that it's not always using the cell phones, going online, and then discussing chismes. They can always have better things to do. So this is one way of making sure that students are able to learn more, especially now that they cannot go out. At least check on online sources. Okay. Then I would just like to quote on Mr. Ronquillo when he said in 1985 that one of the most pressing problems in Philippine archaeology is that of salvage archaeology. Scientific excavation of archaeological sites endangered by construction work, natural calamities, and by looting both by professional and amateur pot hunters is a task that calls for immediate and responsible action. With that, I guess this is all for now. If my paper would be accepted by PNHS, I would be able to share with you the more sources of Philippine prehistory and archaeology publications, because it's not always that when you present a paper, you can always be included in the peer-reviewed issues of the Journal of History. With that, daghang salamat po.
Thank you, Professor Bolunia, for your presentation on the archaeology and archaeological studies in the country. And we have a few questions actually here. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, one is from Felix Rodriguez. Wonderful presentation. What do we know about the use of molecular or genetic approaches in Philippine archaeological research? For example, the use of DNA or genetic markers in the study of flora, fauna, or human population movement or distribution. Thank you.
Okay. For the DNA as genetic markers for flora and fauna, it's easier done because we have already established research with collaborators. So we have Dr. Garong establishing collaborative research with Japanese archaeologists. And then for flora, we have another colleague, Maricar Bellarmino, doing work on palynology and pollen analysis. What is more tricky would be the human genetic markers or DNA, because we have to look into the ethical consideration of doing DNA analysis, although, as we have said, it's quite it's a leap of faith also to be saying, with due how do you call it? With due respect to our IP people, indigenous peoples groups, some of our samples would be going back some thousands of years ago. So we think that we still have to establish whether these are ancestors of their ancestors. But again, we have already submitted some samples for DNA for analysis with colleagues in France before, and then another colleague, Xiao Chun Hong, did initial samples of the human remains from Nagsabaran. So we're doing that with colleagues from different parts of the globe, from France, and then now we're trying to establish collaborative research with colleagues from Germany, and of course our Japanese and Taiwanese colleagues. And of course there is also, I almost forgot, there's always Peter Bellwood, Phil Piper, and the rest of those who have been with us for quite some time now in doing all these kinds of researches that needs laboratories that are sometimes not available here in the country. I hope, EA, nasagot ko.
Thank you, Dr. Bolunia. Apologies for the background. May nagtitibag ng kalsada. Another question from Facebook. Let me just read it here. From Bradley Miles Ramos from Imus Historical Society. I would like to ask Dr. Bolunia, in your personal opinion, as an archaeologist in profession, with the rampant illegal treasure hunting that was happening over the past few months due to lockdown, like in Tayug, Pangasinan, and Davao del Norte, do you think it is time that this kind of activity should be declared illegal by the government for the sake of protecting archaeological sites on being looted?
Yung treasure hunting naman talaga ay, di ba, illegal. Although there are some people who are applying for permits, and they are being given permits after thorough discussion that they're supposed only to do this and do that. So there are steps that they have to do first before they can do their treasure hunting. But mind you, or for the knowledge of everyone, looting, treasure hunting, pot hunting has been going on even, I think, as early as the turn of the 20th century or maybe even earlier, because there were families that thought that they're doing a service by collecting all these materials, because archaeology would have started with antiquarian. And collecting, beautiful. That's why we always hear people, oh, this is a beautiful pot, this is a beautiful blue and white, but nobody would want to look into a broken dish, broken plate. Like a good example that happened to me when I was doing work in Bicol. So I was trying to clean this blue and white shirts, and then a local asked me what I was doing. So I was telling her that these are from the past. This is a 15th century or a 17th century blue and white. And then she said, why am I spending so much time cleaning those broken pieces? And then suddenly she threw the broken blue and white shirt and said, and I was so surprised, and I said, why did you do that? Because she said that she can give me a more beautiful plate, a whole plate that she bought from the local department store mall. So instead of looking at this broken plate, she said it's not beautiful, so I can use the plate that she would give me. So there is this tendency, oh gosh, the dogs are alive. The dogs are awake. So these are some of the problems that we have to look into, because treasure hunters would only want the whole pieces, and then along the way they will destroy the archaeological site. But it's been happening for a long time, so we just have to do more work in informing the local government, because it's the local government who can stop these illegal excavations. And this have been done by some LGUs all over the country. There's one in Mindanao, then another in Panay that I know of, and then there's another one in Bicol.
Hindi, dito na lang ako.
EA?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bolunia.
Sasagutin pa
Wala
ba?
po akong sound. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bolunia, for that presentation. Sorry at merong nagdadamo doon sa paligid ko, so I have to go out, no? Okay. So another question. Do you have like any updates on the archaeological investigations in San Miguel, Bulacan, in Biak na Bato? I think they have ongoing archaeological dig there.
And yung one good thing that there's the archaeological studies program now in Likman, because they have trained some of their students, and then these students have I think they have graduated, and they have asked also to be deputized by the National Museum. So they're the ones at least supervising whatever activities being done in Bulacan now. That is what I know of, I think a month ago. I'm not so sure, EA, if they are doing work now because of this pandemic. Nawala si EA.
Lumabas yata.
Okay, Ma'am Ois,
Oo.
mukhang may connection problem si EA, so I will take over.
Okay.
Let me read some of the questions. Meron tayo sa FB from Hammer Daginod. Sabi niya, Ma'am, among the three main archaeologists emerged in the Philippines, archaeology with Otley. Tapos, what is or their similarities and or differences in taking accounts or acquiring data aside from the remains, artifacts in studying Philippine archaeology as their focus? Yan. So,
Paulit gayon.
mukhang assignment yata ito sa archaeology. Okay. Ano po? Yun daw. Ang question niya is, among the three main archaeologists emerged in the Philippines, archaeology with Bayer, with Otley, what is or are there similarities and differences in accounts or acquiring data aside from the remains and artifacts in studying Philippine archaeology? Yeah, so I think he is asking for the differences in the approach in doing archaeological study.
Ang parating sinasabi ng aking mga mentors, professors before, that the earlier archaeologists like Bayer would, or even us, kaming mga ngayon, would be a product of our time. So during Bayer's time, he would be looking at materials. He would be sending out people to tell him what they saw, given that they would be briefed by Bayer first na ito yung mga hahanapin. And then he would have people all over the country telling him that this is what we found, this is what we saw. And then he was able to amass that thick description, thick data, so that he was able to write the outline review na sinasabi ko na ginawa niya noong 1947. So these are, sabihin na nating cursory look at all the surface materials, although Bayer would also do some excavation later on when he was exposed to the ongoing project in the La Mesa in Novaliches. So yun yung mas naging, how do you call that? Mas na-expose si Bayer to how we should do more archaeology the way it should be done. Kasi yung sa outline review, yung iba doon, hindi naman siya, o marami doon, hindi naman siya ang nangolekta, hindi rin siya punta sa mga lugar. Kasi alam naman natin, mula Batanes hanggang Hulo, mahaba-habang talakayin o paglalakbay.
Okay, I don't know if EA is already there, but meron pong question sa Q&A. Basahin po natin. Good day po, ma'am. Ma'am, ano po ang mga ethical considerations whenever you dig po burial sites?
Number one, hindi ka pwedeng mag-dig na lang basta gusto mo mag-dig. You have to make sure that you do your work first. You do preliminary research with the locals. Yung research kasi hindi naman kailangan sulat ka lang ng sulat. So you have to ask people, the locals, what have you seen so far? Kasi kalimitan, merong gagawa ng bahay, may gagawa ng toilet, may gagawa ng extension, pati nga bakod, and then they encounter a pot, a jar, things like that. Like in one instance, some colleagues were talking with this local person, and then underneath the bamboo ladder, they saw a jar na hindi alam nung may-ari. So pag ganun, kailangan mo munang alamin kung ano yung meron doon. And then, when you do start the excavation, make sure that you're going to finish that. You cannot say na, ayoko nang maghukay kasi ang hirap maghukay. One, in my own experience, to do an excavation of a skeleton, human skeleton, it would take you at least 3 weeks. So hindi pwedeng kung alam mong 1 week ka lang doon sa area, huwag ka nang maghukay. Kasi sisirain mo siya, hindi mo siya pwedeng iwanan. And then you cannot always say na, ay, balikan ko na lang yan. Kasi may kasunod ka kalimitan, may kasunod kang treasure hunter na akala ikaw din ay naghahanap ng treasure. And then also, you have to inform if there's an IP community, kailangan din silang i-inform na we're doing this, we're co-equal as far as government institutions or agencies are concerned, because the National Museum has its own mandate, the NCIP has its own mandate, DNR has its own mandate, and the other agencies. So ganun yung kailangan gawin. And then also, we have to handle the human remains. Once you have already excavated them, you have to handle the human remains because these are persons. Even if they're just skeletons na lang, hindi pwedeng lang yon na yung nakikita natin yung ibang bata, pag nakakita ng yung long bones, yung femur or tibia fibula, biglang nag-screama. Hindi po pwede yon. And of course, we have to inform everyone of what we find in the area. Kasi lalo na pag burial sites, the old people, based on my own experience, they don't want you to disturb the burials of, even if they don't think they're ancestors of these people, because there are spirits residing in those jars or in those burials. So once we disturb the spirits, then it becomes a source maybe of illness for the community, particularly pag ang nagkasakit ay mga bata. So yun yung ilang mga ethical considerations. We are siguro in a way absuelto kasi nga medyo matatanda yung aming mga nakukuhang mga burials. Like yung sa Tabon, the skull cap, which is the youngest, would be 16,500 years. Diba? And then yung mga nahukay ko naman, kaya yung isang hukay ko sa Bohol, which is siguro yung pwedeng i-share na pandemic din, not pandemic but epidemic. There was an epidemic daw according to the locals in the late 1900s, cholera epidemic. So we were able to excavate burials that are contiguous, one on top of the other. So we also have to make sure that we do our best to respect these human remains, kahit na medyo nakakapagod kasi nga yung ribs would be entangled with the femur or tibia of another individual. Hindi mo pwedeng sabing wag na lang. Sige, baliin na lang kita. Yung mga ganun. I hope nasagot ko yun, EA.
Thank you, Professor or Dr. Bolunia. There's another question that we have here in Zoom. Thank you, by the way, Professor Zamora, for taking over. Nangyera muna ako dito. There's one more question here. There are some government infrastructure I know in the past that threaten to destroy the preserved historical sites. How can we address that kind of problem? Thank you.
Ano nga ba yun? Meron naman po, kasi di ba meron National Historical Commission din naman na who is in charge with historical sites. So we have to defer to them unless these historical sites have been declared as declared by the National Museum. Then we take charge of that, and then we discuss it with, let's say, DPWH na you have to make sure that we are given first the chance to check. Pag-check kasi ocular muna, hindi naman kailangang agad-agad huhukayin. But if we know there are structures, then we inform the PWH and its contractors that you have to stop first because there are these are heritage sites that will have to be either documented, excavated archaeologically, and then do whatever mitigating measures we have so that they will not be destroyed forever. Hindi naman kasi pwedeng wag na natin silang patrabahuin. So what we do is this should be fully documented. Hindi pwedeng tinanggal lang, walang documentation, tapos sasabihin na lang natin sa iba, sabi nila meron daw. Wala na yung daw, di ba? And as custodians of heritage, we have to make sure that we have something to show the next generations as part of our responsibility towards them.
Okay, thank you, Ma'am Bolunia. Tama po yan, ano? Kailangan ng documentation muna bago galawin yung mga sites for development. At tama yan, no? Yung DAO minsan ay nagiging doubt, no? Kapag wala nang natitira. Anyway, thank you again, ma'am, for your presentation on Philippine archaeology and archaeological studies in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Okay, so now we are now going to wrap up the day's presentations. To summarize, in the first presentation, Dr. Churchill presented the Philippine cultural experience in the context of our Asian roots. The Filipinos, as with our Southeast Asian neighbors and the Pacific Islanders, share the same Austronesian lineage and culture, rich in history and of course, we have our cultural ties. Dr. Churchill explored the prehistoric, pre-Islamic, and pre-Spanish culture of the country, using archaeological evidences, among others, as guide. She discussed the country's Indian connection through a number of beliefs and words, such as Pathala, Mandala, the Epic of Maharaja Lawana, the Jawi script. Dr. Churchill also discussed the Chinese influences, which dates back centuries, as well as the Islamic influences and which in the country, which include areas in Luzon. She likewise presented a different look on Magellan, on the Magellan expedition, discussed the Baxter Codex, Doctrina Christiana, Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, and an unpublished early manuscript on the Philippines at the Lilly Library in Indiana. She mentioned the relation of Brazil and the Philippines, Mexico and the Philippines, and basically a comment from one of the attendees best fit Dr. Churchill's presentation. The comment said it is intellectually stimulating. Indeed, it is intellectually stimulating. Meanwhile, Dr. Bolunia presented archaeological research in time of the pandemic through archival and online research to enrich existing and future researches on anthropology and archaeology. She discussed the history of archaeology in the country with studies by Alfredo Evangelista, Wilfredo Ronquillo, Eusebio Dizon, and Victor Paz. Dr. Bolunia mentioned that archaeological studies should be available to the public, although it is important for it to be simplified since these are technical papers and full of jargon. She also discussed Philippine archaeological studies during the American period by H. Otley Beyer, Robert Fox, and Wilhelm Solheim to the establishment of the National Museum in 1901, and the UP Department of Anthropology in 1917, and the Archaeological Studies Program in 1995. Other anthropologists were mentioned like Jesus Peralta and Eflonda Jocano. Dr. Bolunia likewise mentioned the discovery of the Homo luzonensis and the butchered rhinoceros fossil in Kalinga, which points to the earliest evidence of human presence in the country at 709,000 years old. Okay, so to our participants, to receive the certificate of attendance, please fill out the evaluation form. Use the link shared in the chat box, which will be shared actually in the chat box. Also, please also take note that we will also be giving the certificate of participation to those that will attend this webinar series, the three-part webinar series. So please join us again in the second day of our conference on November 14, 2020, same time, 9 a.m. to around noon, 11:30 to 12 noon. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's all for now. It has been a wonderful day. Until next time, mabuhay. Thank you po.
This is start.